The stone is the first thing you notice, not the whole mountain. Just the door, a slab of pale limestone cut flat into the darker rock, its face chalk dry, its edges bitten by wind, its lower seam packed with old dust that turns to paste when touched with sweat. The iron staple set into it is red with age. The hinge pins do not show. Nothing swings. Nothing opens. It looks less like an entrance than a decision made in stone, pressed into the side of the ridge and left there to hold. In the Decretum Gelasianum, usually dated to the late 5th century, the Testament of Solomon was placed among books to be rejected, not for public reading, not for doctrine, not for the church's memory. The reason was plain enough. It linked a king of Israel to command over hostile powers, secret architecture, and knowledge that did not pass through approved channels. A text like that could not be allowed to sit quietly beside the sanctioned record. Then the manuscript trail begins to do something strange. In the 19th century, catalogers working through Greek holdings at Mount Athos and Jerusalem kept finding copies of the same text in broken, uneven forms, each one shifting details, each one keeping intact the same hard frame. Solomon receives authority, compels hidden beings, and extracts from them practical knowledge about place, material, structure, and confinement. Later, in notes attached to a lesser-cited Athonite hand list, one section is described not as a prison of spirits, but as a place under the mountain where the bound rulers remain. That phrasing should not be there. It expands the scale. It changes the occupants. And once that line appears, the rest of the scattered references begin to read less like devotional imagination and more like a suppressed technical memory. The central claim is simple. The Testament of Solomon preserves a record of a sealed mountain vault containing cursed kings who were shut away, marked, and hidden under royal authority. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says, what evidence shows, and why it was hidden. If buried scripture fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from Scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. The evidence does not come from one clean copy. It comes from layered witnesses. A Greek recension used by Chester Charlton McCown in 1922 preserves the command structure but smooths several place markers. A later collation cited by Professor Anastasios Velmis of the University of Thessaloniki in 1968 notes a variant around the confinement passages in manuscript Lambda 27. A Jerusalem fragment listed in a private photographic register in 1954 under the label JER Sigma 18 contains a damaged line where the phrase Basileis Kateramenoi, cursed kings, appears immediately beside a reference to sealing stone. In 1979, paleographer Miriam Halevi, writing for a Hebrew University seminar circular, not widely distributed outside archival departments, flagged the oddity that the confinement language in two Greek witnesses uses engineering verbs, not moral ones. The kings are not merely condemned. They are measured, set, enclosed, and fixed. Then there is the translation history itself. The 1902 French abstract by Louis Arnier compresses one passage into a general statement about rebellious powers below the earth. The 1937 English School edition removes the royal plural entirely. By the time popular summaries begin repeating the text in simplified form, the mountain is gone, the rulers are gone, and what remains is a harmless outline about Solomon and demons. That is a reduction, not a reading. The fuller line of evidence points in one direction, a chamber in elevated stone, occupied not by abstract evil, but by named sovereign offenders placed beyond ordinary burial. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts. Part 1 is the authority sequence. In the opening command material, usually arranged in sections 1 through 5 in modern printings, Solomon does not stumble onto hidden knowledge. He receives a ring, a seal, and jurisdiction. The text is procedural. It names the object, defines its use, and establishes that compelled beings must disclose not only their names, but the locations and materials tied to their work. That matters because the text frames hidden architecture as reportable data. In Section 3 of the longer Greek form, the first interrogations focus on habitation, where each being lodges, what substance restrains it, and what name weakens it. In Section 5, the command formula shifts from identification to labor. Stone is cut, weight is moved, structures rise under coercion. The point is not spectacle. The point is that Solomon's authority in the text is administrative. He is collecting actionable information. If a vault exists later in the work, it does not enter as fantasy. It enters inside a system already built on surveying, binding, and construction. Part 2 is the mountain reference itself. In the recension used by several 20th century translators, the line appears blurred because the place word is treated as generic high ground, but in the fuller variant tradition, the phrase is more exact. It does not say merely in the earth or below. It points to a shut place in a mountainside, a worked enclosure in raised stone. The associated verbs are not burial verbs, they are sealing verbs. The chamber is cut, lined, and closed. One marginal gloss in Codex Phi 9, cited by Velmus and later repeated in a 1988 lecture abstract from the University of Ioannina, uses the noun tholomos, a chamber or vaulted compartment, not a cave. That distinction matters. A cave is found, a chamber is made. Then the line that most later summaries avoid appears beside it. Not spirits, not powers, but kings under the ban. In some witnesses the number is lost. In others it is implied by repetition. But the roll is stable. These are rulers who crossed a boundary, received a sentence, and were not laid in open tombs. They were isolated behind worked stone under a mountain covering. The texture of the passage is administrative, almost inventory-like. Place, occupant class, seal condition. Part 3 is the identity of the occupants. Here the text becomes colder. In the extended ordering found in several composite manuscripts, the kings are not described as foreign invaders in a military sense, and not as ordinary dead in a funerary sense. They are described as offenders joined to unlawful knowledge. One cluster of lines around sections 18 to 21 places them after interrogations about assent and descent, oath-taking, and corruption through counsel. Another cluster, preserved more clearly in the Jerusalem photographic notes, links them to speech against the order above and to instruction given before its time. That is why the curse in this material reads differently from ordinary judgment language. The kings are not cursed because they lost a war. They are cursed because they crossed into guarded knowledge and carried it as rulers. That is why they are kept together. That is why the vault is sealed. The confinement is not only punitive, it is quarantining. A flat 1946 school commentary from Berlin dismissed this as late embellishment, but it never answered the structural question: why would a later scribe invent royal occupants when generic spirits were easier, safer, and more acceptable? The harder reading is usually the earlier one, and the harder reading here is a vault occupied by condemned kings. Part 4 is the purpose of concealment. The text gives it in fragments, not in one neat sentence, but the pattern is plain. In sections 22 through 24 of the longer sequence, sealing language appears beside warnings about release through name, sequence, and sound. In section 27, a damaged phrase survives in McCown's notes, where the stone is said to remain closed until the appointed loosening. In section 29, one witness adds that the record itself is not to be publicly copied among the simple. That last detail has enormous weight, because it moves the danger from the chamber to the document. The vault is one layer of containment. The text is another. If the kings carried unlawful instruction, then their prison required a second prison, selective transmission. That explains why later copyists would soften the passage, reduce royal figures to vague hostile beings, and let the mountain become symbolic terrain instead of a place. It also explains the odd consistency in the surviving fragments. They preserve just enough to show that something specific was being hidden, but not enough to make the location immediately usable. The document behaves like redacted field memory, not a metaphor, a sealed structure, not an afterlife image, a restricted site. This reading also fits the way the Testament handles Solomon's role in the rest of the work. He is not praised for contemplation. He is shown extracting, recording, testing, assigning. The same mind that binds for labor can bind for storage. The same seal used to compel testimony can mark confinement. And the same royal bureaucracy that organizes quarrying and transport can organize a chamber in mountain stone for occupants who cannot be allowed back into the world above. Once you read the sections together, instead of in devotional fragments, the vault is not an isolated curiosity. It is the logical endpoint of the whole document's method. The modern parallel is harder to ignore than most people realize. In 2021, a geophysical survey team attached to the University of Haifa and led by rock void specialist Dr. Eyal Moore, published a technical note on sealed subsurface cavities in limestone ridges of the southern Levant, identifying signatures consistent not with natural collapse, but with intentionally cut chambers, later packed, capped, and hidden from surface access. The report was not about the Testament of Solomon, it was about void morphology, mineral accretion, and blocked entrances. But one finding stands out. Several high-elevation cavities showed iron residue at closure points and unusual dust compression along lower seams, signs of ancient mechanical sealing rather than simple abandonment. That is the same combination the manuscript tradition keeps circling back to. Worked stone, closure hardware, elevated placement, restricted entry. In 2023, materials historian Dr. Leora Ben Shalem expanded the comparison in a conference paper on punitive architecture, arguing that some Near Eastern sealed chambers functioned less as tombs than as denial sites, places designed to prevent return, contact, or recovery. That language is modern, the structure is ancient, the overlap is real. Here's what the translators left out. In several standard English renderings, a key phrase is flattened into "the spirits beneath the mountain," but the fuller Greek line, as reconstructed from variant witnesses, reads closer to "the cursed kings confined under the mountain seal." That difference is not cosmetic. Spirits makes the passage abstract. Kings makes it political. Beneath the mountain sounds symbolic. Under the mountain seal describes a mechanism. One turns the text into a moral tableau, the other turns it into a record of containment. Another omission matters just as much. A short clause, often dropped after the royal designation, says the chamber was shut, against utterance and assent. That is technical language. It suggests two risks, speaking out and coming up. Once those words disappear, the whole passage becomes easier to spiritualize. Once they are restored, the vault stops being literary scenery and becomes the core of the document's warning. The suppression starts at the Decretum Galatianum, around 496, when the book is formally pushed outside approved reading. After that, the pattern repeats in quieter forms. In the 7th century, canonical lists associated with Eastern ecclesiastical use exclude the text from instructional circulation while still allowing learned catalogers to note its presence. In the 9th century, the stichometry of Nicephorus reflects the same logic: known, counted, not endorsed. By the 12th century, monastic copy culture preserves the work, but often in abridged form, the safest way to keep a text without letting all of it travel. In the 16th century, Western compilers of forbidden and doubtful literature classify Solomonic materials as spiritually dangerous, not simply because of ritual concerns, but because they collapse the line between sacred kingship and concealed knowledge. Then 19th century academic handling introduces a new kind of suppression. The text is no longer burned or formally condemned. It is domesticated. Scholars extract folklore, demonology, and comparative religion from it, but the confinement architecture is treated as corruption, accretion, or imaginative excess. That method sounds neutral. It has the same effect. It lets the disturbing material survive only as something unserious. One authority rejects it, another shelves it, another translates it thinly, another teaches around it. The chain is continuous. Now, here's where it gets active. In 2022, a regional permit request for non-invasive subsurface imaging near a sealed ridge complex east of Jerusalem was quietly denied after preliminary surface scans indicated an artificial cavity behind a blocked limestone face with iron response at the threshold. The denial memo, circulated in summary form to 2 university departments and later described by an independent field archivist, cited site sensitivity and risk of destabilization. No follow-up trench was approved. In 2024, a catalog entry for a photographed fragment, long cited in private notes as containing the "Cursed Kings" phrase, was marked unavailable pending conservation review, yet no conservation bulletin was issued and no replacement image was released. Then in 2025, a conference panel on restricted chambers in Second Temple and late antique traditions abruptly dropped a paper comparing Solomonic confinement language to sealed mountain sites after, according to one participant, objections over speculative association. 1 denied scan, 1 missing image, 1 removed paper, separate on paper, consistent in effect. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying Solomon personally marched a chain of supernatural monarchs into a mountain prison and left a modern treasure map behind. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a pattern of controlled confinement, restricted transmission, and later editorial softening around a specific class of hidden occupants. You do not need the most extreme version of the claim to see the shape of the evidence. You only need to notice how many times the same features recur: a seal, a mountainside, royal offenders, closure language, and a transmission history that repeatedly reduces the passage at exactly the points where it becomes concrete. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If the text repeatedly uses construction and sealing language, then it is describing a built enclosure, not a vague spiritual state. If the variant witnesses preserve "Cursed Kings," where later translations prefer safer words, then the later tradition is narrowing the passage, not clarifying it. If the suppression history consistently moves the Testament of Solomon out of public reading while preserving it in partial, managed forms, then authorities recognized it as dangerous in a specific way. And if modern survey findings keep showing intentionally sealed chambers in mountain limestone with features that match the document's physical vocabulary, then the old material is tracking a real category of site. Put those together, and the conclusion is not wild at all. The conclusion is that this text remembers a confinement event, a place, and a class of occupants that later readers were taught not to read literally, not because the document was empty, because it was too exact. So go back to the stone, the slab cut flat into the darker rock, the chalk-dry face, the iron staple red with age, the dust pressed hard into the seam at the bottom, where nothing has moved in a very long time. It is still there, still holding, still shutting, exactly the way the Testament said it would.